Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Thursday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And this is video number 5 in response to some objections that have been lodged against my book, Temple to Telos. I have mentioned this several times. The introduction of this book has really created quite a stir. And the reason is simple. If the premises of this book are valid, then all futurist eschatologies are false, pure and simple. And the premises of the book have to do with the fact that Hebrews chapter 9 and Colossians chapter 2 tell us that the temple that was standing in the first century, it was standing when the first 4 feast days were fulfilled. It was not only standing, it was standing valid. So my question is, did that temple not have to be standing? And more especially, did that temple and the cultus and the priesthood and the sacrificial system, the feast day system, did that not have to be still valid for the fulfillment of the final 3 feast days? Now, what's been really interesting to me, and ultimately ironic, okay, is that an awful lot of the objections that have been lodged against my book have been lodged by people who believe that we've got to have a Jewish temple. Some people have told me repeatedly, you see Jerusalem, you got the Temple Institute, and they're training priests. And yet those same individuals have said, well, temple is not really all that important. They can erect a tabernacle or a tent in just a matter of days. Well, if the temple is not important, what's all the fuss about the Temple Institute? Right? And if the temple and the priesthood and the feast days are not all that critical, then why does the writer of the New Testament, Hebrews chapter 9, 6 to 10, tell us that temple cultus mandated by the law of Moses would remain standing, i.e. valid, until the time of Reformation? Why does Paul say in Colossians chapter 2, 16 and 17, that the new moons, the feast days, and the Sabbaths were still, present active indicative in the Greek, were still shadows of the good things that were about to come? Those things had not yet come. That means the feast days were not fulfilled. And since the feast days and, the meats and the drinks and the washings of Hebrews 9, since those were not fulfilled, then that means that they were still valid. And they would remain valid until they were fulfilled. This is the crux of the whole thing, ladies and gentlemen. As I say repeatedly in my book, if you are going, number one, if you're going to negate the importance of the feast days, then you're not on solid biblical ground. I'm sorry, you're just not on solid biblical ground. They were shadows of the good things that had yet to come when Paul wrote Colossians. They were going to stand valid until the time of Reformation. Well, what's the time of Reformation? Well, the time of Reformation, the word Reformation is from the Greek word diorthosis. Diorthosis means to put back in the proper order, to restore. Well, guess what? It is a direct synonym with the Greek word apokatastasis. And Peter in Acts chapter 3 spoke of Jesus and said, whom the heavens must receive until the times of the restoration of all things that were spoken of by all the prophets. Yea, Moses, Samuel, and all of the prophets who have ever spoken have spoken of these days. What's Peter anticipating? Second coming of Christ, to consummate the apokatastasis, the restoration of all things. So, The restoration of all things would be in fulfillment of all that the Old Covenant prophets said. The time of Reformation of Hebrews chapter 9 would be the time of the fulfillment of all the types and the shadows of the Old Covenant. In other words, the fulfillment of the Old Law. So you have restoration and you have reformation, direct synonyms, both of them being fulfilled at the time of the fulfillment of, number one, the temple cultus, Hebrews 9. Number two, in fulfillment of all that the prophets said would come. And it would be fulfilled at the second coming. By the way, someone posted just the other day and they said, well, it's my personal view that the time of Reformation came 2 weeks after the temple was actually destroyed. Well, guess what, ladies and gentlemen? Once again, the apokatastasis would be consummated, perfected, at the time of the fulfillment of all things that the Old Covenant prophets have said at the second coming of Christ. The diorthosis, the Reformation, would be at the end of the Old Covenant law, when the temple and the cultus, the priesthood, the feast days were no longer valid. Guess what that means? That means the second coming of Christ would be at the time of the diorthosis, the time of the Reformation. So here this individual has told us, Reformation came 2 weeks after the destruction of the temple. Well, that means the second coming arrived at the time 2 weeks after the destruction of the temple. Look, folks, the bottom line is this, and the objection that I want to notice today absolutely, completely, totally ignores it. The bottom line is, and once again, pardon me, been doing that all morning long. The bottom line is, the old law had to be in effect with the cultus still valid, still binding, for the arrival of the time of Reformation. Now, some have said and taken note, as I did in the book, but these people hadn't read the book, so they were just kind of taking shots at me. They said, well, the sacrifices were not offered immediately after the destruction of Jerusalem. The temple fell. That's right. The temple fell. Sacrifices were temporarily halted. They were reinstituted at the return of Ezra and Nehemiah, Ezra chapter 2. So there is not, as I have said, there is not a 1-to-1 perfect correlation between the physical standing of the edifice of the temple and the validity of the law. The temple could fall, but the law would remain. That's exactly what happened in 587 BC. The temple was destroyed, the law remained. But you see, in Hebrews, the writer is making the point that the cultus was valid, binding, and operative, meaning the law of Moses was valid, operative, and functioning when he wrote, just like Paul did in Colossians chapter 2. That's the whole main point. So this individual, in response to my book, I'm assuming he had read the book. He shows some knowledge of some of the things that I say. He says, you apparently don't realize how the Sanhedrin was involved in determining the Jewish calendar, beginning with citing the new crescent moon, that is, to determine each month of the year. Based upon those sightings, the festival dates were set, and notice went out to all of the Jewish diaspora for the dates they were to come to the feast. For you to be correct, I called attention to the fact that Jesus, referring to the time of Rosh Hashanah, the time of judgment, and thus the final 3 feast days, except those days be shortened, no elect should be saved. So this individual says, for you to be correct that these last 3 feast days were fulfilled in AD 70, not only would the priests and Levites have to come from their homes all over Israel to participate in those duties during these feasts, but also it would require that all the millions of Israelites would have somehow known to come to Jerusalem to these 3 feast days early, somehow on a date unspecified by you, on days not authorized by the scriptures, but on the days you are assuming the feast were changed to. There are huge problems for this view, Don. He says, and for time, I'll just look at the second part of his objection here. The first part wasn't certainly was not overly relevant. He says the Feast of Tabernacles was, according to the Torah, mandated to take place when the harvest was brought in. That is, when the people paid their tithes. So for the Feast of Tabernacles to have been kept early, i.e. before the harvest season, and the Jewish people leaving their crops in the field to rot by the time they returned, desecrating the Sabbaths of the feast days and honoring Sabbaths those days which were not Sabbaths, shows an utter desperation on your part, which you are accusing others of. The Pharisees, who were rigid policemen on making sure everyone was keeping the law, would not have tolerated such flagrant violation of the law. There were also punishment for anyone violating the festival Sabbaths. Also, if the whole Jewish people who went to these fall feasts began going early and disregarding the Torah, Josephus most certainly would have documented these major changes in keeping these feasts in his many volumes of documentation regarding the temple in the 1st century and its destruction. So really, this is almost an emotive type of, quote, objection. But let's take note of something here. It's interesting to me, this individual appeals to Josephus. And he says, Josephus would have told us if there was such a violation of the law. Josephus would have told us if the people could not or left their crops early and left them in the field to go to Jerusalem early, as you, Mr. Preston, are suggesting. And then let me go back up and read again the main point of his suggestion. For you to be correct that these last 3 feast days were fulfilled in AD 70, not only would priests and Levites have come from their homes all over Israel to participate in their duties during these feasts, but also it would require that all the millions of Israelites would have somehow known to come to Jerusalem to those 3 feasts early, in caps. Now, first of all, he begins by saying, you apparently don't realize how the Sanhedrin was involved in determining the Jewish calendar. Well, that's a little bit condescending, to be honest about it. Point of fact is, I'm very familiar with how the Jews determined the time for the feast days, and particularly Rosh Hashanah. You see, Rosh Hashanah was a feast of the new moon. And it had to be determined, verified, that is the new moon, had to be verified by 3 separate witnesses. Now, due to fog, due to cloud cover, etc., you could never know precisely when the new moon appeared. So what the Sanhedrin did, they would appoint witnesses by three groups of men, and one group would go to this mountain, another to that mountain, another to that mountain. Different vantage point. And when the new moon was spotted and confirmed by those 3 witnesses on top of that, whatever mountain it was, they'd run back to the Sanhedrin and report the new moon has arrived. Now, because of the uncertainty, ladies and gentlemen, because of the absolute uncertainty as to the sighting the appearance of the new moon, Rosh Hashanah was the feast of which it was said, but of that day and hour knows no man. Sound familiar? Yeah. Jesus, in predicting the fall of Jerusalem, in his discussion said, but of that day and hour knows no man. You know what Jesus was saying here, don't you? Jesus was very cryptically, but for any Jew of the first century who would have heard Jesus say, but of that day and hour knows no man, they would have known he was referring to the fact that judgment on Jerusalem was going to come during the time of Rosh Hashanah. You know, the feast that foreshadowed the coming judgment. Now, did it tell which Rosh Hashanah? No. Did it specify the day and the hour? No, because Rosh Hashanah didn't determine the day and the hour. Or the day and the hour of Rosh Hashanah could not be determined. So, like I said, this individual's rather condescending statement, you apparently don't realize how the Sanhedrin was involved in determining the Jewish calendar. Yes, I do know, and I know how it applies to Jesus's prediction of the coming judgment, and I also know how it applies to the Jewish war. I know how it applies to the siege and destruction. Now, the rest of his objection goes like this. For you to be correct that these last three feast days were fulfilled in AD 70, not only would the priests and Levites have come from their homes all over Israel to participate in their duties during these feasts, but also it would require that all the millions of Israelites would have somehow known to come to Jerusalem to those three feasts early. Well, you see, what this individual absolutely fails to realize is that as Josephus, witness to the Jewish war, as he tells us, Jews from all over the world had come to Jerusalem to observe the first four feast days, beginning with Passover. And that is when, you got to catch the power of this, that is when the siege of Jerusalem began. That is when the city was encompassed, first of all by Vespasian, then by Titus. And thus, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the Jewish pilgrims from all over the world, didn't have to go to Jerusalem, quote, early at all. They had already come to Jerusalem for the Feast of Passover, unleavened bread, weeks, Feast of First Fruits, and were entrapped at that time. And guess how long the siege lasted, ladies and gentlemen? 5 months. And thus this objection really is itself a display of an ignorance of when the siege began, the implications of the beginning of that siege, that completely nullifies his entire argument of saying, well, Preston, if you're right, the priest would have had to go to Jerusalem early for the observance of those final three feast days. Not only that, the Jews from all over the world would have had to travel to Jerusalem. Ladies and gentlemen, the Jews had already traveled to Jerusalem from all over the world for the first four feast days, and they were trapped there for the duration of that 5 months that takes us right into August, even September, when the fires were still burning. And so, this objection, to read again part of his second point. So for the Feast of Tabernacles to have been kept early before the harvest season, and the Jewish people leaving their crops in the field to rot by the time they returned, desecrating the Sabbaths of the feast days, and honoring the Sabbaths, those days which were not Sabbaths, shows utter desperation on your part, which you're accusing others of. The Pharisees, who were rigid policemen on making sure everyone was keeping the law, would not have tolerated such flagrant violation of the law. There was also punishment for violating the festival Sabbaths. But you see, ladies and gentlemen, this objection number one, is completely ignorant of the fact that the siege lasted from Passover for 5 months, or is conveniently ignoring it. Because you see, the people trapped in Jerusalem at the beginning of the first 4 feast days could not go home and take care of the harvest. So guess what? The harvest laid in the field and rotted, and guess what? The Pharisees had no control over what was happening in those events. They were powerless. And thus, this couple of objections here fails to note when the siege took place, how long the siege took place, and the fact that the beginning of the siege to the end of the war completely, totally nullifies his argument of people having to travel early if Preston is right. No. They traveled there for the beginning of the feast days. They were trapped for the duration of the 5 months of the Jewish festival calendar. And the temple was destroyed on the 10th of Av. And the temple and the immediate surroundings were still burning at least 2 weeks later. 5-month siege spanning the Jewish festal calendar. This objection has no merit whatsoever. Okay, out of time. Don't forget, tomorrow. Listen, by the way, don't be like so many others who have lodged complaints and they're kind of knee-jerk. Do yourself a favor and get my book, Temple to Telos. Go to my website, donkpreston.com, bibleprophecy.com, and order the book. You'll be absolutely thrilled that you did. There's a wealth of information in here you're not going to find anywhere else. Okay? And don't forget, in an upcoming revision, I don't know when I'll get to it. I've got so many projects here. But I'm going to be including these objections and my responses to them. Okay, tomorrow I will continue my review, response, and refutation of Steve Gregg's book, Why Not Full Preterism. All right? You do not want to miss it, so I'll see you on the flip side.